Hello everyone, welcome to the Week 9 lecture recording for EMS207 2024-30 session. So really the point of this lecture is to really transition you into the second half of the semester and begin looking at digital technologies in a broad sense and as they relate to science and technology as well. So in this lecture we'll be going through a bit of a definition of what technology is, keeping it nice and broad. Looking at some technology challenges and solutions, thinking about how those would affect our teaching. So there's a bit of a societal discussion here. We'll talk about the requirements in the syllabus as well. We'll also be looking at some technology learning models, more to frame your thinking around the use of technology rather than structured guides for how to use it. It's really tapping into that PCK idea. And then we'll, of course, talk about the preparation for the Week 9 tutorials as well. So let's begin. So the question is, what is technology? Essentially, technology is anything man-made around us. Now, clearly, in this subject, we'll be focusing primarily on digital technologies, which is fine, but it's important to have that broad view as we proceed through this. So they're essentially the application of scientific knowledges for practical purposes. So technology often represents the consolidation of scientific understanding for our purposes. So it's a really important aspect of that third vision of scientific literacy where we think about how science is influenced by and influences society. So it doesn't sort of sit by itself. So it can be things like machinery and devices taken from scientific knowledge. So let's do a quick introduction here. There's this really good document that starts to unpack some of the language here in relation to the digital curriculum. It is out of Victoria, but I think this one's quite helpful because we want to demystify some of the language if we can. So we'll just go briefly through this. Check it out in your own time if you can. The resource will be on the learning management system or Interact 2 if that's what we still have. So really the core aspect to digital technologies and how we see them in the curriculum is what kinds of thought processes students engage with as they use them. So it goes back to things like computational thinking, design thinking, and systems thinking, which we talked about way back in the Week 2 lecture briefly, and we will talk about it more to come as well. So they also have to become familiar with the digital systems around them and the idea of networks, the idea of interconnectivity and data moving around, disaggregation and patterns, pattern sensing and use and those sorts of things. So as they develop their understanding of the digital technology, we want students to design, create and evaluate their own digital solutions. So the technology shouldn't just be something that you use to present as an educator. It should be something that the students, through a process like backward faded scaffolding, that they eventually take control of and use themselves. So keep that in mind as you progress with the assessment task here as well. We'll move on briefly as well, but you can really see some of the goals here. It's ideas of abstraction, data collection, representation, interpretation, algorithms, which are guides for solving problems. So we can have them through recipes and things like that. So it also doesn't all need to be hypertext transfer protocol, coding kind of stuff, because we don't need to be experts in this. So there are some coding elements that can emerge, but in years 3 to 6, years 3 to 6, we're looking at sort of block-based, puzzle-based tools, and we'll look at some of those in the weeks to come because there are things that you can engage with as a university-trained teacher without having a great deal of expertise necessarily in full computer programming or something like that. It sets the foundation for that if students wish to pursue it later on. So there are some useful terms to consider here. The key concepts we look at, and it's important to have these in mind as you consider digital technologies, is this idea of abstraction, which is hiding details that are not directly relevant and posing solutions that are transferable across context. So that notion of generalizability, the application of learning beyond the classroom or one specific context. We're also looking at data collection, the different forms of digital technologies and how they operate, things like the internet, LAN, etc., etc. And of course, the big thing are other ways of thinking. Here we have computational systems and design thinking, and there are some nice definitions here that I think should make this reasonably clear. As we talked about, computational thinking is the process of breaking a problem or a scenario down into its discrete parts and seeing how those discrete parts function within the broader whole, the broader ecosystem or phenomenon. So we have a process of decomposition, breaking things down into discrete parts, looking at that as data, user input, time, sensors, whatever data you like, and then looking at algorithms of patterns, sequences of instructions, basically, that we derive from seeing patterns within the data that we have. There is, of course, design thinking, which is the next step from that, which is where when we understand the patterns and the discrete parts and the relationships between them, even with things like cooking, for example, or game design, we start asking ourselves those what if we changed, what if we added this challenge or aspect. And we can do that through cartoon drawing, brainstorms, think alouds, and those sorts of things as well. But it tips into the higher order thinking aspect of it. And of course, system thinking is about understanding the connections and interactions between components within a phenomenon or a system. That can be broadly defined. It could be an ecosystem where there are lots of living things like the Amazon rainforest. It could be an economic system. It could be a system like a university where you see how the different components interact with one another. Like we obviously understand the relationship between class attendance and performance on average, and things like that as well. So have a look at some of that, but we'll move on for now. It's more just me signalling that is a valuable resource to look at. But let's continue with the lecture. So educational technology is defined in quite a number of ways. The AECT, I cannot remember the acronyms, I apologise, considers it the study and ethical practice of facilitating learning and improving performance by creating, using and managing appropriate technology, processes and resources. And I think the key term there is those higher order the use aspect, the human use, rather than being a passive recipient of it, and the idea of ethical practice, which comes into things more and more through AI. The idea of plagiarism and stuff like that. How can AI be a supplement and a tool rather than a way of subverting the learning process? Interesting thoughts, worth discussing, and there's a lot of literature emerging on that as well. The ITEEA considers it to be a inherently problem-based educational technology. It's a tool to solve grander problems. So it does nicely sit with what we've been discussing in this subject, and it's the reason why Assessment 2 should logically, hopefully for you, flow on from Assessment 1. And the ISTE takes a more technical idea and calls it the full range of digital hardware and software used to support teaching and learning. So to that end, we try to focus in this subject on technologies that should be readily available in most, if not all, classrooms. So often free stuff, things like the Google Suite and those sorts of tools, general computer tools, nothing too specific. So there are some key perspectives on this. These key perspectives on educational technology need to be teased out. It's a bit like the PCK idea of asking ourselves what the purpose of education is in a context and what we're trying to achieve, making that explicit. So educational technology can be a media or delivery tool. I'm sure many of you found really fascinating videos to share with your students in your lesson plans that were, rich, and they brought aspects into the classroom that you couldn't replicate without them. So there's still a base level of audio-visual communication in these tools, but it can't be the sole idea, and it certainly can't be where you end up alone for the next assessment. We also have educational technology as instructional systems and instructional design. So the more passive idea. So if you take something like Mathletics or Reading Eggs, where essentially the learning occurs passively, the system is automated to some degree, and the technology teaches in a sense. It can do that, and it can be good for reinforcing key concepts, for practice ideas, times tables and those sorts of things. But the vast majority of technology is still not particularly strong at dealing with more open-ended and complex ideas. For example, it's very unlikely we will be able to automate the marking of complex assessments in university. So marking your lesson plans and assessments can't really be automated. We have to read it and make judgment calls, and it's largely the same for you as well. The next one, of course, is educational technology is vocational training. So the idea that it is there to assist the workforce and prepare people to be employed. And that's true. We do ELMO training, in things like ethics and different strategies up here. It's often closed-ended. It's important, but it can't be the sole idea as well. Education should be for workforce participation, but it can't solely be for that. And the other one, the fourth one here, which I think is quite interesting, is educational technology as computer systems. So basically the idea here is that the teachers are using the technology as a tool. So instead of teachers taking it and figuring out how to use it, teachers manipulate it for their own uses. So it puts teachers in control rather than teachers as passive recipients. And that's what we're striving towards in this subject. None of these ideas is wrong on their own, but ignoring all the potential uses or not being fully aware of them might be a limiting factor in your classroom. So we should look at the kind of main errors of digital technology. This is probably incomplete. I'm sure we're kind of entering the AI era, and I'll probably add that to the lecture as we go on here. But of course, in the 1970s, we had the pre-microcomputer era, where these systems were largely housed in major institutions like universities and the government. So technology was the domain of the elite, so to speak. And as a result, teachers did not like this because they lacked any control. It was coming in over the top of them. It was pretty closed-ended, and it was taking some degree of control away and adding complexity. So in that era, it wasn't well received by teachers. We then, of course, entered the microcomputer era, where computers were in households. I still remember the big kind of MS-DOS machines clicking around with these really out-of-date but still charming two-dimensional, blocky-looking video games and things like that. But the teacher involvement was still exceedingly complex. You needed to know how to code. The user interface for non-experts was just non-existent. And the incorporation of technology into the classroom was still very challenging. I mean, you might have been sitting in a classroom with 20-odd students and one computer. So its practical use was quite limited. For me, it was often more, in the primary school, it was a reward, a bit of a time filler, get to play a game if you did the right thing. But there were video discs being used to deliver curriculum at the time, and we had things like logo programming being used and taught in the high school. So in the computer labs there was some use, but that integration into the typical classroom was not fully there yet. It was still more or less the domain of very interested, very computer savvy students. It's a short history there. I mean, this was largely occurring in the 80s and 90s. In its own way. Then, of course, in the late 1990s, the internet became the dominant feature. So instead of relying on discs, I remember having the disc collection of an encyclopedia that I had to use for school assessments. And then in 1999, we got the internet, which meant we had access to everything. Now, that's both good and bad, obviously. It became a mainstay in many classrooms through the 2000s, mostly, though, because computers were still mostly held by the teacher at the front or at the side. The teacher would be primarily using the technology to add those elements to the classroom, videos, websites and those sorts of things, unless you were lucky enough to go to a computer lab, which were relatively infrequent. Then, of course, in the mid to late 2000s, we ended up with the use of mobile phone technologies, where iPhones and iPads became increasingly accessible. There's still some debate around that. You've got the banning of iPhones happening, which I don't agree with in and of itself, truly. I think it's a ham-fisted solution, and we should be using them as teaching tools and helping students to understand the downfalls and issues associated with technology addiction and overuse and those sorts of things. So there's great value in them, but of course there's a socio-economic issue related to this where not all schools will have suites of iPads. I've taught in more wealthy private schools that had them. Most public schools don't. So it's still not at the point where it's completely ubiquitous yet. We've got lots of things coming next. We've had VR and it's kind of worked. I mean, Pokemon Go was one, might be a bit out of date now, and some of those things, Google Glasses. So those have kind of failed in some ways. Now we've got AI, and it's going through a similar trajectory where something like ChatGPT has shown some profound ability in some sense, but it also tends to hallucinate and produce information that is fundamentally incorrect, which is not ideal. Trust me, go and ask ChatGPT and it's kind of free form some questions. It's usually out of date. And because it sort of tends to search the internet broadly, it can pick up misinformation. So ask it about something you're familiar with, sports team, part of Australian history, whatever it is, and you will find huge mistakes. So it has use. But through legislation, court cases, it's now refusing to give advice on a lot of topics that it used to. So it's becoming dumbed down, but it still has great use for the editing of materials, the production of images and those sorts of things. Although for me, the images spook the living daylights out of me. They can be funny, but they are quite scary as well. They're kind of in the uncanny valley realm. So that's another area where there's benefit to be had, but it's raising complexity as well. It's a great tool to consider. I'm not fully using it yet in my work, but I'm sure there will be uses for it at some point. So I guess the point of that was to give you the sense that these cycles continue and there's continuous revolution in the technology space. It's continuously influencing how we think as people and educators, and we should embrace that and use that as part of our PCK, our understanding of pedagogies, technology, if you want to go TPCK. So the lessons from the past is to know technology is a panacea for education. even in a space like this where I'm using technology to create a lecture, the core of this is still me, a person, talking to you, another person. And through our assessments, we're communicating to each other repeatedly. So that idea of social interaction at its core never really goes away, particularly for higher forms of education where it's more complex, like a university degree. For some training stuff like Elmo, great. That's our system where we make sure we understand the legislation around universities. Important for covering the uni's backside as well. Teachers usually do not develop technology materials or curriculum. Usually. We think that period is probably ending to some degree or another. Teachers are now becoming more proficient in creating little websites, creating little resources that suit their needs, and hopefully this subject will make you part of that change that is already occurring. Technically possible does not equal desirable, feasible, or inevitable. So technology is not an inherent good in and of itself. In fact, it can get in the way. So we need to reflect on the technologies we're using, whether they're overcomplicating things, and to return to our idea of backward mapping, whether it's actually achieving what we want to achieve. So it's part of our thought process, our professional and pedagogical experience repertoire, our PCK. It's a tool at the teacher's disposal, not a replacement for the teacher. And anyone that suggests that has just a fundamental misunderstanding of how education would operate. You'll hear it, people will say it, but if you're not in education, it's a bit like saying, well, I've been to a restaurant, therefore I know how to manage one, and I'm a chef. Technology has changed faster than teachers can keep up as well. So we're trying to get a base level of technological literacy. It's more about evaluating resources and making decisions as to how they fit with your vision of teaching. And that can change. Look at COVID. A bunch of teachers were required to rapidly learn digital technologies when they otherwise did not have any use for them. Although they've probably taken lessons away from that, even as they return to face-to-face. Older technologies can still be useful, as you would imagine. And as I just suggested, teachers are always more important. You are making decisions. You are the person that knows your students, that knows the curriculum, that has a proper higher education. So this is very important. So what's likely to be in your toolkit when you enter a school of any type? Well, we want to think these through. You're probably going to have some handheld technologies. The degree of comfort you have in using them is probably up to you to some extent. Phones, iPads, tablets. You'll have your laptop, PC, you'll have your HDMI cords, some image sharing tools of some sort, your peripherals like keyboards, mice, webcams, etc., and external storage as well. For me, Google Drive is one of the few things I'll pay money for because its use is infinite to me. I can work on academic papers, I can upload audio marked files and share them with students, I can have big resource banks, I can use them for my teaching. It's I wouldn't say it's fully transformative, but it's something I couldn't move back from necessarily. So there are three broad types, as we discussed. There are instructional technologies where students learn from the technology itself, whether you design for that, whether it's open or closed. There are productivity tools where students learn through the use of the technology. So something like word processing on Google Docs could be part of that. And then there are administrative components that make secondary features more efficient. All of them have an important role in teaching, like the fact that we use a central system rather than the old handwritten roles, the fact that I can now calculate marks in a spreadsheet as opposed to doing it on a calculator or in my head. These are important. But in this subject, we're looking at students learning through. So think about when you select technologies for this assessment task coming up, think about what the task requires first and foremost. So can you think of any examples of this from your own experiences? You've probably seen a myriad of stuff, good, bad, all sorts of things. Have a reflection on this because we'll be talking about this in the week 9 tutorials. There are social issues to deal with as well. We can't get away from those. There are quality of life concerns, issues of privacy, doxing, cyberbullying, these sorts of components. But like many things, good quality education and sound policies and expectations can do a lot of the heavy lifting here. It can't be what it was when I was in high school in the mid-2000s, early to mid-2000s. It was it was the Wild West. There were no policies. It was emerging. The teachers had no idea what it was, and we were doing all sorts of crazy stuff. So we hope that doesn't happen anymore. There are fears about technology overuse. And to me personally, as someone that grew up with technology, I was an avid video gamer. I don't think it inherently leads to a sedentary lifestyle. I think we can walk and chew gum. We can exercise and use technology. So don't let the moralising get in the way of your own evaluation of technology. I mean, it can lead to overuse like anything else. It can be addictive, but we can also work around that. I talked about some of those things, and also issues of malware, spam, and other malicious actions. So we need people to understand safety on the internet, and that's part of the journey you'll be taking your students on, helping them become prepared for the world beyond the classroom. But you're only part of it. You're one part of their 12-year journey. There are other issues where there's a lack of technology funding. And indeed, when the funding is provided, it's often not made clear to the teachers what the expectations are, which is another challenge. What do you want us to do with this? How do we change our practice? What's the goal? Because the goal should be some form of transformative education that is achieved through the technology. The technology is not the end game itself. The teacher and student accountability for quality and progress is a big part of this. And we say it's a joint thing. We're accountable to our students and they're accountable to us to some degree. The debate over best practice rages on, and it's been captured in the media. It's a bit of the well's been sort of poisoned here a little bit, where there's a lot of hysteria around this, and I do feel like the technology aspect is used to demonise teachers. And of course, the reliance on distance education is a tricky one as well. I've written about this in my own research. We lose a lot from distance education, but we also gain a lot through social equity. One of the things I love most about working at Charles Sturt is, as a distance education provider, I can engage people in learning who would never set foot on the Bathurst campus, because they're parents, they've got jobs elsewhere. So we can educate people through distance that would not have access, and that's really important. But things are gained and lost in that transaction that we need to consider. There are cultural issues, depending on which schools you're in. Some students have lots of access, completely untethered access, inappropriate access to technology. It's no longer a do I have it or not. It's a weird mix of which things do I have and not have, and how are they being supported in the home life. There can be racial and gender equity issues with this, although I hope they're disappearing. We talk about issues of female representation in STEM. Historically, in technology studies in particular, women are underrepresented, girls are underrepresented, but increasingly fewer students overall are going into technology, which is a concern as well. I've got a doctoral student, Richard Carroll, who's looking into that after a career in technology education. And students with special needs have particularly unique challenges that are often more costly, and school systems are burdened. So it does allow, though, for rich forms of assessment, things like portfolios. It allows us, through our phones, to take pictures of things, put them in portfolios, potentially share those with parents. So there's a whole bunch of sharing and data use stuff that can be highly beneficial for teachers and give them control over the data in a way that something like NAPLAN doesn't enable. So I think there's a really great opportunity to turn the tables here in terms of the data we use in education through the technology as well. There are lots of different tools to use, and we'll talk about some of those in the weeks to come, because they can form part of your diagnostic, formative and summative assessment suite and enrich some of the good quality, dialogue-focused, hands-on, inquiry-focused teaching that you'd be using in your science classrooms. So there are some things to consider here. So a couple of problems that technology can potentially help to solve, although they won't solve it by itself, to be quite honest. So technology can help with gaining attention. Certainly, like using music for a bit of Pavlovian conditioning can be quite cool there. It can support things like manual operations at higher learning levels. So I've often allowed students to use things like calculators in tasks where they're doing more complex work, and I'm not particularly worried about their conceptual understanding of addition. So if I've got students trying to balance like a UN style thing where they're balancing budgets in the billions, I'm not worried that a Year 6 gifted and talented student doesn't understand addition, subtraction. So we use the calculator or the spell checker to remove that burden, that barrier in the moment, and to do some checking as well. So we use some of that sort of stuff. It illustrates real-world relevance. We can find these great videos. We can connect and bring people into our classroom as special guests. You can use Zoom, all sorts of stuff to bring the world into the classroom and take parts of the world into your classroom through pictures and videos and audio files and all sorts of stuff. QR codes are cool too. It connects students with an audience for their writing. So you can do some stuff with that, or like forums and social media, but I'd probably keep that closed. Maybe family and friends sort of stuff. The privacy issues for me are still quite relevant there. Engaging learners with real life collaborations potentially, although those are kind of in that realm of outward facing pedagogies that it's unrealistic to do every day in the classroom, but could be something you work towards. Ultimately, though, what technology does when we move away from just writing a report to doing filming to producing multimedia forms of assessment or artifacts of learning, it creates that sense of pride and achievement, motivation that we've talked about being so important, and allows for cooperative learning. We can share, see your first assessment in this subject for examples of that and the work that you've been doing. It can support different needs, so it can be useful for things like skill development and practice. Students can learn study systems in abstract ways. There's some really good Google Suite stuff where you can change variables. There are simulations for things like pandemics, which might be a bit on the nose, where you can ask questions about changing various different variables and seeing what happens. The multimodality inherently allows more students to engage. If they have, say, a literacy problem, they can listen to the instructions and still participate, just as an example. So it turns disabilities into capabilities. It also allows for, depending on how it's integrated, through contact learning or a form of homework or something, a self-pacing component. A bit like how we probably release these lectures pretty early in the semester. You have the opportunity to look at more of them, because when we create resources in the digital space, they sit as artifacts. So, if you were teaching in COVID or distance education, you can use those resources for students when they need them. It's really helpful for us, the tutors, probably to say, well, look, it's week 5, but if you want to think about the next assessment, go listen to James's lectures. So there's some flexibility and self-pacing that can come to this as well. It's better for grading. I would agree with that. I don't think I have marked an assignment with writing for 4 years. For me, it's all audio files at this point in time, occasionally video files, because I can give better feedback that way, better tone. So we can use technology to prepare students for their future learning. So it's learning to learn skills, self-management, self-reflection, dealing with more complex tasks, dealing with collaboration. Essentially, technology guides them more to the world that they will inhabit. I find it quite baffling, the idea of banning technology in the classrooms. It seems to be stem from this view that students will sit nicely in their rows and write in silence. And that's just fantastic if that were a job that actually existed in some way. But the world is messy, jobs are messy, they're complicated, they rely on communication. So this is preparing them for the world and making the classroom more an information age classroom rather than a post-industrial age classroom, in a sense. And it allows for things like visual literacy with our cross-curricular integration too. We can look at the use of images to create an effect on the viewer and stuff of that nature. So there are some general trends. Actually, we've talked about that. We've got some augmentation, gesture-based stuff. AI is probably the big one, but I've already talked about that briefly as well. There are some trends in education, like flexible learning environments. The Interact 2 site is a version of that as well. Adaptable assessment options, where students could, for example, have different options in their assessment for presenting information, even if the information that is required is fixed. So that could be something to play around with as well in your next assessment, because that idea of choice is something we find very important, and the research supports that as well, with proper parameters and scaffolding, not just choice openly, but choice that is informed by the teacher's conceptualisation of the learning through our backward mapping process. So what do we see in the K-6 syllabus? Well, more or less the same sorts of themes. So the definition that we would see is that it extends beyond the tools and technology inventions of society and involves the application of human skill, knowledge and techniques and processes to expressive and practical problem solving in all aspects of human life. So it's not simply learning about them, like we're at a museum, but it's learning to use the tools. So the students aren't doing stuff. Those sentences start with students do, students apply, students create. They make their own quiz, they make their own video, perhaps with your support and modelling and joint construction. So it's, again, heavy emphasis on higher order thinking stuff, typically. And we'll look at a few examples of this in the syllabus as well. Developing ideas and solutions. I feel like I'm repeating myself, and I probably am. But if we look at some of the stuff in design and production, just to tie it back to our focus on the syllabus, because that is, of course, the primary one of the primary driving forces of EMS207. So if you look at design and production, it's not about making a computer out of a potato or something, or coding. It is very much the core, it's the thought process behind design and production. So if we look at early stage 1, it's develop solutions to an identified need. No mention of computer or technology there. It's more about that computational thinking idea, the design thinking idea. You can see there as we move up, it becomes selects and uses, material, tools and equipment. So broadly defined. It can be physical stuff too. It can be simple tools relative to our understanding. And then, of course, it's things like describes, follows, and represents algorithms to solve problems. Like, how do you get ready in the morning? Instructions for that. So often a lot of procedural writing with maybe decision points, decision trees, all sorts of interesting opportunities that do not require a computer, because this work, the conceptual work, has to happen first so that we can appreciate what the technology offers us. So this is about the concepts of computational thinking, design thinking, and systems thinking that we've talked about. It's not just about teaching them how to code. So we can see it in the living world as well. The technology aspects tend to come through here. This is more agricultural technology. So it's not the digital technology aspect. So you do see that variant component where it identifies how plants and animals are used for food and fibre products. So, the agricultural side of things is in living world, but it is not it's not digital technologies. It's a separate component, but still very important. Same thing here with material world, where you can look at things like conductors and see, their use in technology. Obviously conductors like copper allow for the transmission of electricity and data. Copper not so well, fibre optics a little bit better perhaps. And of course it's the same sort of thing here where we're looking at force and energy. So it's the materials and the energy that's used with these materials as well. So technology is there, it's both digital and it's both physical and more typical things that we'd see out and about the joint. So I would say the syllabus has a pretty good grounding in that, and it's nice to see those technology variants connecting human technology into the science disciplines as well. So we see the creation of human knowledge and the application of human knowledge emerging in the syllabus, which is quite positive. There's a whole digital technology strand that I think is really cool, and you might like to look at this to some extent in your next assessment task. So you can see here, this is primarily focused on the identification of digital systems, identifying digital systems, and explores how instructions are used to control digital devices. So, it begins very early in early stage one. And then, of course, those verbs become more complex as we have explains how digital systems represent data, connect together to form networks and transmit data. And we've got some resources there. Of course, the syllabus unpacks that more fully with the content points as well. And you'll find resources around all over the place that will help with that particular strand of education. So if we think about what it means to be digitally literate, we talked a bit at the start of the year about what it means to be scientifically literate, and there are overlaps, of course. These sorts of, I think you could classify them as these sort of 21st century skills that science, technology, and a whole suite of other areas in education are kind of gunning towards, where it's about having functional skills, creativity, safety, etc. So you've got your sort of foundational ideas there. It's about communication, collecting, sort of sorting and evaluating information. So often having a bullshit detector is a big part of this. We no longer have, it's not so much access that's the problem, it's filtering information that is our challenge. So cultural and social understanding of technology, but for me that big one is critical thinking and evaluation. Is this information useful? Is this tool useful? If so, why or why not? What could I do differently? And we want them on that journey, on that trajectory moving through school. So we've talked about a bit of this in the syllabus here. You can have a look at the national curriculum, which I'll bring across briefly now, that unpacks some of this. Obviously, we've got the New South Wales version, which is the science and technology syllabus. But if you want to look at some of the ideas that really come forward in the national curriculum, which is still what we're bound to through the New South Wales syllabus, you will start to see some of the different themes emerging here. The themes are around investigating, communicating, creating, managing and operating, and applying social and ethical protocols. So there is a social element to it, there's a wellbeing element to it as well. And there are some nice resources for this sort of work as well. But you can see some of the aspects here, like recognising intellectual property. The idea that this belongs to someone else, this thing that I'm showing, and I should let the audience know that I didn't make this. It's not to say they do full APA referencing, but they acknowledge the source or they critique the source. They don't just copy and paste chunks out of Wikipedia and call it their own work. So it's about good, rigorous intellectual practice from an early age, applying personal security protocols, things like passwords. My son's in year one, practicing using his password and not sharing it and those sorts of things. We've got the investigation component there as well, defining and planning information searches, and there are, child-safe versions of these things that can be used. Locate, generate and access data and information. We can do that together. We could look at something like a Bureau of Meteorology if the students were sophisticated enough, and select and evaluate data and information. And there are some really kind of cool web resources out there for that sort of stuff. Similar with creating as well. And we will show you later in the semester something, there's a typography called the Bauer typography that links technologies to these particular aspects or important areas. But if you look at the general capabilities, this unpacks it a little bit further and makes it more specific. So this goes all the way up to year 8. So you'll primarily be concerned in the primary sphere with, this all goes all the way up to year 10. You'll be interested in levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is year 1, early stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. And it will tell you more precisely what they would be doing to achieving those different elements that we talked about that are prioritised in the Australian curriculum. So you can see there in the recognises intellectual property, the year 4 student acknowledges when the digital products, when they use digital products created by someone else and start to indicate the source. So not full referencing, but acknowledging, I found this website somewhere else, it's from the Australian government or something. So embedding that process into what we're doing is quite important. Security protocols apply standard guidelines and take action to avoid common dangers. So there is some kind of aspect to that e-safety stuff. So go and have a look at this. I think it's quite helpful to have printed out there as well. And the select and use of hardware. And, as we can see by year 4, they're identifying and independently using a range of software, bits of tools, software functions and things like that. So there's a lot of choice there for you as well. So it can be nicely incorporated into science, English, HSIE and those other discipline areas as well. So whenever you've got them using the computer, it's probably worthwhile having a think about these different areas and whether or not you're addressing them, even through particular prompts or framing. Not entire lessons necessarily, although that may be useful at different stages as well. Moving through some more here. We can sort of see here some of the differences in what might be expected. So these are put here to give you a sort of visualization of what we'd expect from, let's say K-2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. So in K-2, we'd be expecting them to create a range of solutions using simple toys like robots or recording data with a software application like a camera. So they should still be using, even in those very early infant stages, technology for specific ends. So if you've got them doing, little walk around the school grounds, they should be using the iPad to take videos. I mean, my son uploaded a video to my wife's personal YouTube account of his toy bear wandering around, and it stayed online for months, and we didn't even know he'd put it on there. So there you go. Badass. But they can use that technology, I guess, is what you'd say. They begin to learn about common systems and the patterns that exist within data, primarily through the organisation, manipulation and representation of numerical, categorical, image, audio data. So those ideas of putting things that are different and the same together, pictographs. So the connections to things like mathematics, storytelling and literacy are quite strong, and using the concept of abstraction when defining problems. So identifying really important information, such as the significant steps in making a sandwich. Knowing scratching my nose probably isn't super important, but cutting the bread is. So those ideas of algorithms or steps to solve a problem are identified in real life first, and then we can put changes on it. What if you only have one slice of bread? What if you need so-and-so's asked for this component or something like that? So it's about following processes. Similar sort of thing here. And as you can see, we go through, it starts to model, like in year 3 and 4, we're looking at modelling simplified real-world systems and simple guessing games. And that's them creating things, not just you showing them that. They have to create simple guessing games and real-world systems. They might use more advanced stuff here like interactive whiteboards, microscopes, maybe starting to use some spreadsheet stuff as well. I wish I'd learned that in school, actually. It's really useful. And of course, they're starting to use some appropriate programming languages that have graphic elements. And we'll go into some of that later on as well, because you can actually learn that with your students. There's so many resources out there that you could essentially learn together with you as being the adult who is a more expert learner, but learning alongside them nonetheless. And years 5 and 6 really get into more abstract ideas, having different representations of data across different forms of graphs and images, transferring stuff across systems, identifying problems in algorithms and making adjustments. So that kind of idea of critical analysis and problem solving is really, I guess, consolidated in years 5 and 6. But it's important to think about this idea of digital natives and digital divides as well. So moving on from the syllabus briefly, Many teachers often make the assumption that students have a native ability with technology because they've grown up with it. I suspect now with the newer generation of teachers, with many millennials like myself, I think that might be going by the wayside. The bottom line seems to be people are good with the technology that they use. Most of you will come to university and a lot of the technology we teach you is still quite new to you, even though you are, most of you would be considered digital natives in that you grew up with, none of you had any concept of a world before the internet and ubiquitous access to technology. But there are still socio-cultural and economic factors that cause divides. It may not necessarily be having and not having technology, it's to what type of technology you have, how strong the support is, how well it's connected to your learning and those sorts of aspects as well. So technology use in lessons always needs to be accompanied by clear modelling and scaffolding. It is unreasonable, regardless of what level you are teaching at, to assume that people understand how to do it. So if I wanted you to make a digital resource, I will teach you how to use it. I will teach you how to upload to YouTube. And if 90% of you roll your eyes thinking, I know this, that 10% that didn't will not be disadvantaged. That's the principle. I mean, I remember observing a lesson when I was a prac student where students were required to make PowerPoints, and that was an assumed part of knowledge. So the students were talked about had discussed with them the expectations, the content of the PowerPoint, but they weren't taught how to make a PowerPoint. So it was a small school. I think 4 of the students knew how to do it, but the 5th had really never used PowerPoint and became extremely upset as he felt left behind. It was not pleasant, and it was a good learning moment for me because I reflected on how I might do things differently. Simply using technology is not enough to actually ensure that learning outcomes are enhanced or that we're meeting the goals of the syllabus. So it's not sufficient to say, oh, look, I didn't write the notes on the whiteboard, I put them on the display. I had them up on the big screen. It's not enough. So this is an old model that I quite like because it gives us a nice framework, the Leander model, to think about how we might be, what our perspective as teachers might be on the use of technology in the classroom. So there are essentially 4 ideas: resistance, replacement, return, remediation, in how we integrate or don't integrate technology into our teaching. They're not fixed ideas. They can change. They can change between content, between context, day to day with different teachers. So it's something to reflect on. But let's start with that reflection. So the first one here is resistance, which occurs when teachers just straight up and down refuse to incorporate a new technology in the classroom outright. I would argue this is becoming increasingly uncommon because as time goes on, more and more teachers will have backgrounds in using technology themselves. We're probably all using things like Netflix and computers, and everyone was producing and typing up assessments at uni. So it's not necessarily going to be a complete Luddite issue, and a Luddite is someone who just doesn't use technology, basically. So you may have personal resistance, which means you do not personally value technology, so you do not use it. But you would be doing your students a great disservice to ignore technology and not give them a proper instruction and grounding in it because you personally don't value it. That's important to consider. And then, of course, there's contextual resistance, where teachers choose to focus on traditional print literacies because they are the focus of an outdated assessment system. I don't think it needs to be a binary choice between one or the other. I think we can effectively do both because more multimodal digital-based forms of communication serve to enrich and help us to further understand the nature of written communication as well, because we make choices in moving between modes. So are any of you resistance people? I mean, it'd be pretty tricky. You kind of have to use it even to access this lecture, but I'm curious, is there any resistance there? Would you like to see all the technology banned? I mean, I don't agree with the outright banning stuff. I mean, I know it's popular, certainly is on talkback radio, but mostly because people want school to be like it was when they were kids. But school needs to be what is needed for the modern world, not what it was like back in the bad old days. Then we have the replacement idea, which is the other extreme. I don't like pens, I don't like quills, I want to be in a VR world and just use nothing but technology. So this occurs when a teacher basically is replacing all traditional literacies. I guess it's in its most extreme end, we could try to automate all the instruction here. I could have an AI voice do all my lectures, we could have no tutorials, it could all just be modules, and we could automate all of it. Seems unreasonable, and probably wouldn't have many students get through because there wouldn't be a lot of actual learning, communication exchange, and it would really fly in the face of all the constructivist ideas we've talked about. But given the limitations and pressure of modern teaching in Australia, one would have to assume this is a pretty uncommon approach. And it's certainly not a scalable approach across all the schools, from the most advantaged, particularly the most disadvantaged schools. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, my view is at some point, we as teachers need the ability to stand in a room and deliver something and to facilitate something. The technology can fail. In fact, it will often fail, and we need to be prepared for that. I mean, one of the worst/best tutorials I ever had about 6 or 7 years ago occurred in an education research subject, so students didn't want to study it anyway, so I was already on the back foot. The entire technology room failed. So I had to deliver a hybrid lecture/tutorial off the top of my head while sort of putting together some notes on a page. It kind of worked, and the students were kind of impressed that I didn't just cancel the class because I did know my content. I was passionate and I was willing to talk about it off the top of my head. It wasn't as good, but that was the purest exchange because there was no technology. So I don't think it's possible, and I think it should never replace good, earnest intellectual engagement in the learning process from humans. We have the return model. So this is often where a lot of people end up. I'd say most of you, very few of you will appear on either extreme end of the scale here. But the return model is where we say, yeah, we'll use technology only to do things we've always done traditionally. So there is no use of technology to transform or elevate the learning. So it's just bringing in efficiencies, basically. So this is a common middle ground, but it could be saying, well, instead of you writing something out in your best handwriting, you're going to type it up. No change, no incorporation of images, no decisions that the computer allows us to make, just the same thing, but on the computer. Reading a news article on an iPad. So I could have this in the paper, it's on my iPad, but I'm engaging in the reading left to right, top to bottom in exactly the same way with no change, no reflection. Or using a note projector for note copying if you're particularly old school. In this instance, the learning's not fundamentally changed. How we're engaging with our learning is not changing in any sense, but the efficiency is improving. Still kind of helpful, but it can't be the end point. What do you think of it? Is this something that you might hold? Look, all of us hold it at some point or another, but we have to be aware of where we could go. And then the next stage beyond this is remediation, which is where we combine old print literacies and new digital literacies to create new meaning, to better understand each particular perspective and create something entirely different and new in terms of engagement. And we've seen lots of examples of this through collaborative text, through various digital websites. Being able to access information from around the world through a simple Google search really allows us a remediation aspect to some extent as well. So in this model, students move from passive recipients to the creators and analysts of the information presented. That's important. That's what moves us towards what the syllabus is asking for, rather than just doing what we've always done. But instead of worksheets, it's now just a form to be filled in. So they're doing something different. So it's the cognitive level that the students are engaging with, rather than what they're physically doing. I keep harping on that, but that's really what it's about. There are other ones as well, like the SAMR model. That's probably a bit newer, but essentially it's got some of the same sorts of features where you, when you're considering a new technology, you can have the substitution idea, where it's a direct tool substitute. So instead of using Microsoft Word, I now independently use Google Docs. No change. I'm not collaborating. I might as well be typing in Word, but that's what I've chosen to do. So it's just no change, just a complete technical substitution. Nothing inherently wrong with it, and we all do it from time to time if an app breaks or we find something better. Then we have augmentation, where the technology allows functions as a direct tool substitute, but with a functional improvement. So if I take that same Google Doc that I was typing in independently and I invite my collaborators to type at the same time, I now have a functionally enhanced system, because instead of us sending copies of it around and wasting time, we can all be present in the document simultaneously. So we have a functional improvement, but not a transformation. Modification occurs where we can have a significant task redesign. So back in the olden days for Assessment 2 in EMS207, we primarily did smart notebook work. That was what we had. We didn't have the Web 2.0 tools. So that's what we did. And it was largely PowerPoint-based stuff because there's just one smart notebook sitting up the front of the classroom. That's it. So they were really fancy PowerPoints. But in the Web 2.0 era, where we can use QR codes to scan, we can send links to one another, we can, add data, have things over time in the cloud, and not be bound by thumb drives. We can now fundamentally modify what that task is. So instead of it being this sort of flat resource the teacher uses, it can become an interactive resource that everyone is using and contributing to. And of course, then there's the option to fundamentally redefine the task itself in a way that was previously inconceivable, not unconceivable, goodness. Connecting and getting information from, across the world, for example. The example I used was my former PhD supervisor, Professor David McKinnon, operating a radio telescope for students in Canada while it was nighttime in Australia and daytime in Canada, a task that would be otherwise unfathomable without the technology. Unless you were wealthy enough to jet set your kids around the world, but I don't think that's many of us. Anyway, that's the summary if you want to keep that. There are some components in the curriculum to look at as well. We've covered some of these already now, but there is one kind of neat one. Because one thing we often have is, hang on. We can actually, this website will take you through the technology tools in the curriculum if you'd like to look at them. Have I got this here? No, I don't. So you can look at those technology tools in the curriculum if you'd like, because there are ICT resources through NISA. And that can give you a sense of what's kind of approved if you're not sure what you can and can't use. Anyway, moving along. So the reflection task I have for you, and I understand this lecture is probably running a little long, is think about how these areas of the continuum could be addressed within your teaching. So have a reflection on those. Think about what you might do when you're out there practicing. Have a look at the resource. So a couple of reflection questions to get you moving towards the tutorials. What approaches to technology use have you observed while on a professional experience placement, or in your own experience as a student perhaps, or as an SLSO? What have you seen? And I don't mean that as a critical. We're not getting out there and saying, oh, this is bad teaching or anything like that. Instead, it's more, well, have you seen a lot of return kind of ideas? Have you seen lots of efficiency components, but not necessarily a lot of transformative ideas? And how might you incorporate technology into your science teaching and general practices as well? So we need to start having those brainstorms now so that we can get the ideas necessary for the second assessment task. So the question is, who will you be teaching? As another factor to this, to go back to our PCK model. Basically, you'll be teaching really Generation Alpha, although there's probably a new generation coming through soon. They're probably now under 10s, if I'm being entirely honest. And what are their characteristics? Well, they're pretty much perpetually online. They look up to YouTubers. They are pretty technologically savvy, but still don't fully understand how it relates to the world around them. So they need a lot of guiding to think about here as well. So something to remember, I guess, as a takeaway point to all of this, the learning objectives and the needs of the learners are still the paramount aspect to all of this. They're not the end game. They can feel like the end game technologies because they're flashy and they often cost money. But they're simply another tool in your repertoire that you might use in any particular instance. So what you need is an understanding of what technologies align with desired pedagogical approaches and outcomes. So your professional judgment as emerging teachers is the key aspect to all of this. And there may be times where you choose to reject technology for something that is more traditional as an approach. So what are some of the tasks you can do this week to get going in the second half of the semester? Well, complete any tasks or anything set by your lecturer or subject coordinator. I'm not sure where the assessment is at this point. I won't comment. Read the following sections of the Module 3 Module 3, 3.8, 9 and 10. Bring your laptops and tablets to class. Have a look at assessment item 2 and bring a copy of your assessment 1, your first assessment, to class, because we will hopefully be identifying opportunities or directions from that assessment that you can take for the next assessment task. But if you would like to change stage level or knowledge and understanding, or your knowledge and understanding focus, you are very welcome to do that. All I would advise is that you communicate with your tutor so that they can give you the best advice necessary. But anyway, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back again next week for week 10.